Like the bearded man said, the man here needs no introduction. Don't want to introduce Seth Cooper. Wait for the documentary. In the meantime, watch him outside. I want to make remarks as I go along, give context to what we're talking about so that you can think about your questions. What is the horizon? The epistemological, the ontological, the theoretical, the political, the affective, the cognitive horizon of black conscious thought in relation to psychology? Or, put differently, how might we put BC thought in lecture rooms, in therapy rooms? I'm going to come back to this question. Can we teach blackness in psychology classes? As a matter of fact, can we teach whiteness in psychology classes? So the first question I want to ask Seth is this. Could you define for us, as we have done elsewhere, but elaborate a little bit more about this idea of black conscious psychology, specifically of Biko?
Well, Kopano, I think I must comment on the fact that actually we do teach whiteness in our classes in the main, because most of the research done has come from Western Europe and North America. And so the great body of psychological literature actually emanates from the West, and we have replicated it in our classroom situation. So that's a given. That's the axiomatic background. And if we think we're only talking about it in the southern tip of the African continent, make no mistake, we're doing it in Latin America, we're doing it particularly in Asia, where the enablement of looking at our own condition is not really happening, because we've accepted the hegemony, like Glenn pointed out earlier, of psychological science being European. So let me dispense with that question straight away. To get back to the basics, the classic definition of black is all those who by law or tradition have been oppressed, excluded in South African context, and this comes from the early 70s, and who identify as group in the realization of their aspiration. So the issue of blackness did not and does not have degrees of melanin in pigmentation as a qualifier. Indeed, it goes against all categorization, because the need to classify is something that those in power or wanting to retain power will impose on the rest of us, because those classifications come from them and it impacts the rest of us. Anybody who has a need to classify, to categorize, whether it is those in the South African context, the four big major so-called racial groups, or not, has an intention to diminish the humanity in somebody else. And we have been the recipients of that over time, such that, in a sense, black consciousness failed. What we tried to do, Sam is right here, Sam Woodley, one or two other people were here at that time in the early 70s, where we affirmed who we were. So you take the, I think, let me just deal in the context of what the Maldonados, others have said here. The whole issue of beingness goes to the heart of black consciousness psychology. So if you take the old classification of white and non-white. If you remove the white from non-white, you're left with nothing, nihil, nobody, negative. And we're not negatives. We are who we are, and we don't need somebody else to give us that appellation to express our full potential. But it's easier said than done, because we all are repositories of collective history, socialization, and de-education, if you like. So whilst we may have said Mangani was the first DG of education, in the last 25 years, we have actually entrenched non-whiteism in our society. So that we had, and we still have, those t-shirts which claim 100% Zulu. Or in the Western Cape, we're not white enough before, we're not black enough now. Same in KZN, where you've got these huge collections of so-called colored and so-called Indian. So the whole essence of taking the term black, which, remember the period, in the late 60s, you're facing the Vietnam War, the opposition to Vietnam, the war in Vietnam. You're facing student ferment in the Sorbonne, various other places. It was the period of young people taking to the streets, much like the spring that was aborted in 2015 and 2016. So we were part of that, if you like, internationalization. And it was to affirm who we were in our own terms rather than having somebody else identify us. So that identification of black was a positive affirmation of who we were, because if you look at the dictionary meanings of black, it's opposite of white, which is pure, angelic. This is black, it's dark, it's foreboding, it's evil. And we deliberately took that to create a positive out of that. So today when people say I'm black, they're really meaning more melanin than anything else. And so when you get somebody who's very fair-skinned claiming they are black, some people get shocked. And I think that realization we need to rethink, because it is who you identify as than somebody else making that identification. And I'm not going to the example of the California woman who misrepresented herself and so on. But it is that. Right? So if I were to describe myself, I would say by accident, I happen to be somebody of fourth generation indentured labor in this country. But I'm African because I'm in Africa. And I'm black. When I'm South African, my political sensibility tells me that I'm not a geographic entity. There are only 3 countries in the world that are called by geographic names. The Central African Republic, this country, and the latest one, South Sudan. Everywhere else, the English language calls it North Korea, South Korea. But in those countries, they don't. So we are geographic instead of being a nation. And my own preference is to say Azani. Right? So I'm giving you a little bit, if you like, about who I am. Because that's the kind of thing that many people get confronted with. My own kids get confronted with that. Many of you get confronted with that. Your kids and your grandkids get confronted with that. Or to put it in the lingua franca of the struggle, that's more closer. Getting to Robben Island, it was ngumni. You know, which clan, where are you from, kind of thing. Where, you know, whose great grandson are you? And I was confronted with being a leader of the Black Consciousness movement, and most of the 76 generation saying Nkulua, big brother. Everybody is called by Umatiba, Nokwindla, etc. And you don't have this name, so we actually created a name for me, and that was Jongilizwe. Now there's no clan name like Jongilizwe. So if you take it literally, Jonga, Park, Sea, Lizwe, the nation, Jongilizwe. And I'll never forget the first weekend in that single cell section in prison, and we fought to get out because we were younger and we needed to play soccer. We thought they'll take us to the general section to play soccer. No, they took us around the general section to a field out there. And when young comrades, you know, who were proliferated in the prison, black consciousness adherents proliferated in Robben Island until they eventually became ANC. You had this call, Amandla, Jongilizwe. And old man Mbeki was in front of me and old man Susulu. And they looked around because they'd never heard this clan name before. And here you saw this character behind them. And it was I. And for all his socially, he was a Stalinist, old man Mbeki. His face grew visibly small. That here somebody else who's not Xhosa had the temerity to be called some kind of clan name like that, you know. So it's those kinds of issues because we still have non-whiteism in our country. In our government, we still have non-whiteism because we're afraid to affirm ourselves because while we're a majority, we're a cultural non-entity and minority. The majority position, politically, economically, and visibly socially, has tended to be European. So our advent comes at a time, and this is Western Cape now, where the non-European unity movement was a very strong force in the Cape Town area. And we rejected non-European because that was another form of non-whiteism. Why should we be another continent when we should be pro this continent? So that kind of negativism was something we totally rejected. And it's about that essential identification with yourself and being comfortable in your skin with who you are.
I want to follow up on this. I mean, you say about this non-whiteism. But I want to preface this because my students are here. And sometimes there's a real struggle, at least that I sense, about identifying with Africa. As a matter of fact, identifying as black if they are of a different pigmentation. So let me preface this for 2 minutes. So this dialogue follows a number of interactions on WhatsApp, in other forms, on email with Saths, precisely about this thing, about blackness, about black consciousness psychology. I had let it slip, so look behind us. I had let it slip my mind that this year marks the 50th anniversary of the 69 conference of Biko's tenure in the leadership of Sasso, the South African student organization, which came to play such a decisive role in conscientizing students and then vibrated outward about this black self-love, about what blackness means, or who black people are under apartheid. So this is a point about history, about political history, about economic history, about blackness as a fact within that. How to love while black, how to love black, how to be as black. Now, could you help us? Could you help my student? Could you help me about this? That if, for instance, you take a decolonial term as in fact historicization, that here are people who have been thinking about this. How would you, you've already touched on this, Seth, about that you identify as African, and that you had a clan name, Jongilizwe, that you were black. But for students who struggle today, what would you say to them about claiming this identity of African, of blackness, or at least relating to blackness? So You're talking to a class that's made up of white students or students. Ta-Nehisi quotes as a great way to say this. Those who would be white. And he repeats this several times, right? That those who would be white, because whiteness is a position in the world, it's a position of privilege. How do you teach them to relate in this more, in a decolonial way, in a humane way? That's the white student. The black students are on there to love while black. What do you say to them?
First of all, I think, if you were to take the majority of whites, and they're a minority in the world, the majority world in the language that the International Union of Psychological Science and other international fora uses, the majority world is that world that's outside of Western Europe and North America, right? Specifically north of the wall that Trump is trying to create in North America. And if you look at the media portrayals of having arrived, whether it's celebrities, whether it is the thin slips of a 00 size model, and so on, the majority of whites don't meet that. Right? So you need to actually turn that around and look at it, because the majority of people, if you just take out, if you add or you subtract melanin, we're all this, physically, biologically, science tells us, we are all the same. Ons is dieselfde. We have the same ingredients. We have a differing degree of melanin. We have hair. Some may be a little bit curly. Some may be straight. But we have exactly the same ingredients. This is what distinguishes us from animals. We human beings, as Sobukwe used to say, there's no race. There's one race, the human race. So if we were to affirm our sense of being, we would affirm that common humanity. But you see, you can't reach that place if you, when you look in the mirror when you get up in the morning to brush your teeth or to comb whatever hair you have left or not.
What is this thing about hair?
You and me.
I mean, really?
See, I knew I'd get a rise from him. You have to actually accept this image, because it's not going to change. Unless you've got the money to do a serious makeover, you are who you are. And if you don't accept yourself for that being, you have a dented, fractured sense of identity. And that identity reflects not only internally, but it reflects to the other. I have met people who are the most arrogant racists in this country. Those who would beat you to a pulp without thinking. But the moment I realized, and that was in my early 20s, that however huge these guys were, they actually were terrified little insecure beings. So the racism of white superiority didn't come from a superior internal position. It came from a terribly dehumanized, fractured sense of self, because they were confronted with the sea of blackness. And that was the terror. And even in the worst days of being tortured, and I'm not looking at it now, 2020 or hindsight vision, and that's when it cracked for me. The moment I realized that they were more afraid of me and my comrades' ideas, on that day, they could do whatever they liked, but they would not make me disavow my beliefs. So I stood for what I stood for, and many others did that. And this trial, the so-called Sasso PBC trial, in which I was the first accused, was the only trial in South Africa of ideas. We didn't commit any acts of terror, although they were terrified by what we did. We did not maim, kill anybody. We organized. We used, I mean, if Shose is a little shy about what she did, many of us did so many other things like that, that you had to be comfortable at that particular space in your own affirmation. Okay, so I'm giving you a sort of, and you asked me to give
Yep,
to
yep,
take
yep.
you through a raconteur position, so I did.
And I like it. We have about 6 minutes, Ping. So I have I have a question I wanted to ask, which you have touched on it different ways about this relationship. I call Seth a political psychologist, and the emphasis in political, as opposed to a political psychologist, which is a branch of psychology. And I wanted him to talk about this, but because he's spoken about it in one sense, because he understands, at least he has lived this relationship between politics and psychology. I want to give opportunity to you to ask a question or two to Seth about his politics, his psychology, his leadership in global psychology. Okay, if no one is going to venture, let me put it again, Seth. Of course, you definitely understand that we are all immersed in politics. Psychologists, psychology students, and within the modern colonial territory known as the state, the nation state, this fact that we relate to the state to politics is all real to you. But there's a certain brand of psychology that says if you can think positively, you'll have a good life. If you can get an education, you'll get a good job. So forget inequality, forget the World Bank structural adjustment programs, forget politics, forget the state, unless you need an identity card or you want to get divorced. But there are other psychologists, and Seth is one then. Cooper is a political psychologist. Now, Seth, talk us about then how you understand this relationship. I mean, the students perhaps who are not psychologists, maybe somewhere at UCT were already doing this. So how do you do this psychology in politics and politics in psychology?
You know, the dean in arts at WITS in 1984, when I was asked to teach a course in community psychology at WITS, asked for my lecture notes. And I said to Jill Straker, I'm not going to provide this because this university prides itself on academic freedom. But he had asked the question, is he going to teach politics or is he going to teach psychology? And, some of these things are a little uncomfortable for these institutions, but the fact of the matter is when you live in a system where politics consumes most of your life in terms of what you do, what you don't do, what you have, what you don't have, and your very being is shaped by politics. It's difficult not to be political, at least at an awareness level. You need to be aware. That doesn't mean you have consciousness. You act on it. There's a huge difference between the awareness and the consciousness, but that's another topic altogether. We were confronted with the fact that there's something wrong with this picture, even though we came from segregated institutions. And for a lot of you, you don't know what I'm talking about. You don't see those signs that have been put up here. Probably you can pay a lot of money on eBay for net verblanks and so on. Those signs are not there anymore, but they are in the cobwebs of our memory, and one little trigger brings it to the fore. Right? So we look at ourselves as, am I up to it? And we tremble, and most of us then fall into that trap. So politically, I made the decision to be activist at that time because there was nothing happening. Forget the the romantic history that the Francis Melis have written about, and people saying we liberated you. Nobody liberated us. The big banks and de Klerk came to an understanding, and the result is the crap we've got now. We did not have a revolution, and so we have the revolution internally, where we are struggling to be a nation because we're struggling against ourselves and who we are and what we want to be and how we can arrive there. So for me, I'm a political being. I've chosen deliberately to stay out of party political activity, even though I've been probably the only person not of the African majority to be president of a national political liberation organization. But psychology came to me because I was studying, if I wasn't kicked out of the University of Durban, Salisbury Island, I would have probably ended up in the arts. Sam and others were great choreographers and other actors and so on, but I couldn't. I studied law, and our group was the only group that was, and all of us were university students, were denied study privileges. So it was only in the 7th year of my imprisonment that I was allowed to study again. So I had a couple of years to look at the UNISA calendar. It was a thick prospectus, and I realized I'm not doing science, I can't do it because you had to do experiments. I'm not interested in commerce, that's why I still remain without the millions. But psychology is something I could do, and I wanted to get a career. Like the Jews escaping the pogroms in Europe, that feeling of getting something behind your name and getting the terminal degree, hopefully my brains are not fully dead now, having a PhD is what I had planned. And that's exactly what I went ahead and did, very single-mindedly of purpose and following through. And so psychology became my life. And this very institution, as Tyrone pointed out, in January 1994, we created the Psychology Society. Today is actually the anniversary of the register being opened in 1975 for psychologists. So this is another historic occasion. And I think we need to celebrate ourselves because nobody else does. We need to affirm ourselves as psychologists and as full human beings, not half human beings. So at the rendezvous of victory in April to May 1994, when you had half human beings entering government with people who believed they were fully white, that massive contradiction and clash persists till today. And that's why we can allow a child to be killed in a pit toilet and think nothing of it. If it was a white kid, we'd all be up in arms. Now let me correct myself, it would never happen to a white kid. But that's why I am who I am.
As you can see, this conversation with Cooper is going on, and I don't know where it's going to end. Ladies and gentlemen, I have nothing else to add. Seth Cooper.